Subcommittee will come to order. This is a subcommittee hearing on examining the status of U.S. trade with Cuba and its impact on economic growth. And the chair will recognize himself for 5 minutes for the purposes of an opening statement. I want to thank the members of the subcommittee for participating in the first trade hearing on Cuba in the 111th Congress. I recently visited Cuba with my colleagues in the Congressional Black Caucus. We met with President Raul Castro, and our chairman, Barbara Lee, and I personally met with former Cuba President Fidel Castro, along with Congresswoman Julia Richardson from California. A lot has been said and written about that trip to Cuba and about that meeting. Because of travel restrictions, many Americans don't know what Cuba has become. What I witnessed there compelled me to call this hearing to assess U.S. trade policies toward Cuba. I believe our current trade policy with Cuba is a failure. We must reevaluate our trade policy's impact on both the Cuban and the American people. I strongly believe that expanding and diversifying our exports to Cuba will be beneficial for both countries. Some argue the current embargo should be maintained as a political tool that has proved to be effective, as was the case with South Africa. However, I must say that the current embargo on Cuba is not a multilateral embargo, and we're in a different political and economic environment today. Unilateral sanctions are usually problematic and ineffective. Cuba has opened its doors to the entire world, and the world has walked steadily in. All nations in the Americas, except the U.S., have resumed diplomatic relations with Cuba. All of our economic competitors, including China and Brazil and Mexico, Japan, Canada, and the European Union, are currently trading with Cuba. Cuba has also made it clear that the same doors are open to the U.S., and our policy should not prevent American companies from doing business with the Cuban people. We're looking for new markets to penetrate. Our companies want to compete globally, and our unemployed workers want jobs. Now is not the time to ignore all of the opportunities that are presented to us, and I believe that Cuba should be treated like other trading partners with similar political and economic conditions. Liberalizing trade with Cuba is not without precedent and has already proven beneficial to both the U.S. and the Cuban people. In 2000, when I and other members of Congress voted to approve a modest opening of trade, the overall exports to Cuba rose from $7 million in 2001 to $404 million in 2004. However, I must add the so-called cash in advance rule initiated by the previous administration in 2005 has complicated an already difficult process and caused Cuba to cut back on its imports from the U.S. Nonetheless, the United States has been Cuba's largest supplier of food and agricultural products, with almost $2.7 billion in total sales. Having said all of this, I am not naive, nor am I blind to Cuba's challenges. It is undeniable that Cuba has serious political, economic, financial, and social problems. Like many developing countries, Cuba has many regulatory hurdles. To be sure, political and economic reform must be initiated by Havana inside Cuba's borders. However, it is also undeniable that some progress has been made, and that the embargo in many instances has actually increased the suffering of the very people we are trying to assist. Since the fall of the Berlin Wall, approximately 28 nations have undergone transitions from communist regimes. countries that were less isolated from the West achieved more successful and prosperous democracies than those that were isolated. I believe that Cuba can make a similar transformation if we fully engage the island nation in the global economy. I commend our president for his leadership in easing the current restrictions on Cuba. This is the first step in the right direction. I support a more rapid move towards normalization of our trading relationships with Cuba. Today's hearing is just a beginning in a series of steps that I intend to take to do all I can to both open up markets for U.S. commerce, especially for small, minority, and women-owned businesses, while also at the same time to help bring liberty and prosperity to the Cuban people. Now I yield back the balance of my time, and now I recognize the ranking member of this subcommittee, Congressman Rodanovich, for 5 minutes for the purposes of opening statements.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for calling this important hearing to examine our trade relations with Cuba. Appreciate it. This subcommittee's jurisdiction includes non-tariff barriers to trade. As we saw in an earlier hearing in the subcommittee that examined ways to promote our exports to help our economy, increasing our trade exports to revive our economy is a path that we should pursue. We manufacture many world-class goods and services the world will buy if given a chance. Today we examine quite a different topic, Cuba and our special situation with that country. Our embargo on trade with Cuba, except for food and medicine, is a long-standing policy I support due to the Castro regime that has been in power for over 50 years. President Obama has indicated a desire to go down a path to change that policy, including incremental changes to permit remittances and travel by Cuban Americans back to Cuba to visit their family. Other pundits have suggested that we go further to normalize relations. I believe that that would be a mistake until the people of Cuba are free. If that time comes, I would fully support a change in the policy. Our agricultural exports would find a receptive market, particularly in Cuba, where about 80% of its food supply is imported, and the country would be a natural destination for our fruits and vegetables, among other products. Unfortunately, the tyrannical oppression continues, and to pursue trade with Cuba is a major affront to those who have given their lives for the freedom of this Caribbean nation. I cannot justify in good conscience a change in policy that may produce marginal increases at best to our economy, and those benefits are quite questionable. It is true that the embargo has not yet affected the bipartisan policy goal of regime change, but it is equally true that foreign investment and normal trade relations with Cuba by other developed nations has not produced any change. If we turn a blind eye and set aside our leadership as the world's promoter of democracy and freedom to follow in the footsteps of others, what do we expect will occur? Thus far, the Castros have been able to use trade with other countries to further their own goals and enrich themselves without benefit to the people that they proclaim to care so much about. The Castros care so much, they do not tolerate political dissidents, they suppress free speech, and limit religious expression, including the establishment of religion-based schools. Since they assumed power, religion has been suppressed because it was counter-revolutionary. In short, a Cuban citizen has limited control over his own being because that right has been taken by the Castro brothers. In one of the truly humanitarian exchanges after Raul Castro took over, Cuban citizens were permitted greater freedom to move within their own country. Can anyone here imagine not being able to travel freely within our borders or send your child to a school of your choice? Well, maybe we can imagine that given the administration's recent decision to eliminate school vouchers for children in D.C., if you have the money to send your children to an elite private school, I guess that you don't have to worry about vouchers for others. Many would like to see the travel ban to Cuba lifted completely from a purely substantive point regarding its effect on our economy that would provide little to our GDP and may even hurt our own domestic travel industry. Let's remember, travel and tourism to the United States is one of our better exports that generates many jobs. Taking steps that would permit a one-way street permitting travel to Cuba without reciprocity would adversely hinder our balance of trade as we import more tourism. Add to that the substitution effect of diverting travel to Cuba that might otherwise have flowed to Florida or other domestic destinations, and I can only see us losing economically. In short, increased travel and tourism may only hurt our domestic tourism industry without benefit to the Cuban people while simultaneously filling the coffers of the Castros. Telecommunications is also viewed as a possible avenue to export more products, but doing business in Cuba requires a joint venture with the Castro government. Whether the net effect would be positive is debatable. Certainly other countries that do not maintain a trade embargo with Cuba have been free to expand their markets in Cuba. However, democracy advocates have yet to see the benefits of those ventures. This may be due in part to the very limited financial resources of the average Cuban citizen and the affordability of telecommunications services. Why anyone thinks that this will change if a company providing the service as a U.S. company rather than their current provider escapes me. As long as the Castros maintain a regime which represses individual freedom, oppresses dissenting political views, and expresses hostility toward religious expression, while at the same time maintaining a state-controlled economy to the benefit of the Castro family and their adherents, further trade relations beyond humanitarian aid in the name of making a buck is an injustice to the Cuban people and their brave freedom advocates. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
The chair now recognizes the fine gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Sarbanes, for 5 minutes for the purposes of an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I certainly don't need 5 minutes. I'm in a learning mode today. I'm looking forward to the hearing. I appreciate your convening it. Obviously, the economic embargo on Cuba is a delicate topic. It seems to become more delicate every day, and more people are coming to the discussion. You've rightly acknowledged the human rights concerns that exist, but you've also noted the arguments for modifying or even eliminating that embargo, and I'm looking forward to hearing the discussion today. I yield back my time. Thank you.
The chair now recognizes my friend, the gentleman from Georgia, Dr. Gingrich, for 5 minutes for the purposes of an opening statement.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I want to thank you for calling the hearing today on this important issue of the current trade embargo with Cuba and its economic impact on our country. In the face of our current economic struggles, our responsibility is to bolster the United States economy by expanding trade in a fair and open way that creates jobs domestically, and of course we look for every opportunity to do that. However, trade policy is not just economic, as we all know, but of course it's also foreign policy. In the case of Cuba, the lure of trade with the United States must be heavily conditioned on the improvement of human rights in that country. In fact, the oppressive communist Castro regime has a widespread history of human rights violations and is currently listed as a state sponsor of terrorism by our State Department. Therefore, I have supported and I will continue to support the embargo, and I do not believe that the United States should lift this embargo until Cuba makes significant reforms that expand freedom and civil liberties for its citizens. Over the past decade, there have been some concessions that have been made for humanitarian purposes, including remittances for family members of Cuban Americans, as well as restricted travel for immediate family. Most recently, the fiscal year 2009 Omnibus Appropriations Act made some more modifications to existing travel restrictions, and the Obama administration has called for additional changes to remittances. But these need to be closely monitored so that they benefit the people of Cuba and not just the Castros and the Castro government. In the nearly 50 years that this embargo has been in place, there's one question that remains. Will Cuba trade with the United States improve political and economic conditions for the Cuban citizens, or will it simply reward and endorse the oppressive communist government run by both Fidel and Raul Castro? In the intervening time, we have seen a number of our allies in the Western Hemisphere, this has been said by Chairman and Ranking Member, and Europe as well openly trade with Cuba, yet Cuba has made very little improvement in human rights conditions despite this open trade. For these reasons, I believe that the federal government, and this subcommittee in particular, needs to proceed very cautiously as we hear testimony today and we debate future ramifications of trade with Cuba. I look forward to hearing from both panel of witnesses, and at this time I yield back the balance of my time, Mr. Chairman, and I look forward to having an opportunity to question the witnesses.